It's the classic story. A young, beautiful family moves into their dream home, but before they can even settle in, their dream home becomes a nightmare. Here's the thing, folks. You just never buy your dream home. It's not going to end well. You never buy your dream home, and you never move anywhere for a fresh start. Because the only thing you're going to find is demons, baby. But Derek and Maria Broaddus clearly didn't watch enough horror movies, because in 2014, they bought their dream home. Now, Maria had grown up in Westfield, New Jersey, and apparently had dreams of raising her family there. But if you watched my video about Westfield, you'll know that this town has a pretty high bar of entry. And in the case of the Broaddus family, that bar was a whopping $1.4 million for the sale of 657 Boulevard, a stunning shingle-style house built in 1905. Now, 657 Boulevard is an exquisite example of Gilded Age architecture, with a front porch accented with Ionic columns and a front-facing center gambrel-style roofline. But before we get into the time that the Broadduses owned 657 Boulevard, let's talk about the history of the house. The first owner of the house on record is Harry Lincoln Russell, a real estate developer. Now, I couldn't find any information about whether Harry Lincoln Russell had the house built for himself or he simply purchased it already built. But in 1905, he was the first owner on record. And then in 1914, Harry Lincoln Russell sold 657 Boulevard to one William H. Davies for a whopping sum of $1. Now, even in 1914, this house was worth more than $1, but Lincoln sold the house for $1 to William H. Davies, who took ownership and would go on to serve a single term as mayor of Westfield in the 1930s before dying of a heart attack in the house in 1947. The house was then inherited by Davies' son, who sold it to Derek and Maria Broaddus in 1951 for $1. Now, I don't understand economics, and I know everything is all made up, but $1 in 1951? I know boomers are always going on and on about how you could buy a car back then for the price of a cantaloupe today, but something's going on here. Anyway, the house didn't sell again until 1955, when the Birds sold it to Lawrence and Mary Schaefer for a more reasonable sum of $23,000. Like, that's at least an actual amount of money for once. But the Schaefers didn't live there for long, and the house sold again in 1963 to Seth and Floyd Bakes for an undisclosed amount. Hopefully not $1. Seth and Floyd Bakes lived in the house for the next 30 years, and they raised their children there, who have gone on to say that nothing strange ever happened to them while living in the house, and that it was a very idyllic place to grow up. But in 1990, the Bakes sold the house to John and Andrea Woods for $370,000. And in a perfect example of how the housing market has become utterly fucked beyond comprehension, when the Woodses were ready to move on from 657 Boulevard in 2014, they sold the house that they purchased for $370,000 for almost $1.4 million. Now, let's talk about the Broadduses themselves. Derek and Maria met while attending University of Fairfield in Connecticut together. And after college, the couple moved to an apartment in New York City together, where Derek embarked on his career. And he climbed the ranks at General Star Management, a Berkshire Hathaway company, where he eventually became vice president. And then in 2002, the couple moved into a $300,000 three-bed colonial-style home in Scotch Plains, New Jersey. Then 6 years later, they moved from Scotch Plains to a house in Westfield. It was a modest house at $770,000, and it had 3 bedrooms, 3.5 bath, like a nice little screened-in porch, but obviously a much more modest home than 657 Boulevard. And they had a much bigger move in mind. And in 2014, when the Woodses decided to sell their home at 657 Boulevard, Derek and Maria entered the bidding war with hopes of buying the historic house and making it their forever home. Now, in May of 2014, just 1 week before the sale to Derek and Maria was finalized, the Woodses received a strange letter in the mail. The letter was from someone who signed off as the Watcher. And though the letter seemed slightly cryptic in nature, the Woodses apparently live a different life from you and I, because they just crumpled that shit up and threw it in the trash. And then apparently thought nothing more of it. I mean, aren't you curious? Where's your sense of wonder, baby? Don't you watch any unsolved mysteries? I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm too paranoid, but I could get a robocall and I have to fight the urge to run around, close all the blinds, and sit in a corner with a knife in one hand and 911 on speed dial in the other. So if I got some strange, ominous letter in the mail, I'd be needing to take an ambulance to the psych ward that night, because that would about do it for my anxiety, you know what I mean? But John and Andrea Woods, they're living in a different movie genre universe from the rest of us. And they didn't lose any sleep over this mystery letter. And on June 2nd, 2014, the sale of 657 Boulevard was finalized to Derek and Maria Broaddus. And only 3 days later, Derek and Maria received their first letter from the Watcher. The first letter had a handwritten envelope addressed to the new owner. Derek found it one evening after working late to complete some painting in some of the rooms before the family moved in. And the letter began, innocently enough, reading,
"Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood."
But as Derek read on, his blood chilled.
"How did you end up here? Did 657 Boulevard call to you with its force within? 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out. I see already that you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be. Tisk, tisk, tisk. Bad move. You don't want to make 657 Boulevard unhappy. You have children. I've seen them. So far I think that there are 3 that I have counted. Are there more on the way? Do you need to fill the house with the young blood I requested? Better for me. Was your old house too small for the growing family? Or was it greed to put me your children? Once I know their names, I will call to them and draw them to me. Who am I? There are hundreds and hundreds of cars that drive by 657 Boulevard each day. Maybe I'm in one. Look at all the windows you can see from 657 Boulevard. Maybe I'm in one. Look out any of the many windows in 657 Boulevard at all the people who stroll by each day. Maybe I am one. Welcome, my friends, welcome. Let the party begin. The Watcher.
Derek was understandably shaken by this letter, and he raced around the house, turning off all the lights and searching for an intruder. And he called the police, who kind of had a just like, "That's a fucked man" response to it. Besides, also suggesting that he move a piece of construction equipment off the back porch, lest the Watcher use it to smash a window and gain entry. And so that night, Derek and Maria, who were still living in their old house in Westfield, emailed the Woodses to ask about the Watcher. And the Woodses told them that they too had received a strange letter from someone named the Watcher right before the house sale was finalized. But besides finding the note odd, they didn't think much of it. And though the letter made similar mention of the Watcher's family observing the house over time, the Woodses said that they'd never received anything like it in their 23 years living in the home. Still, the next day the Woodses went with Maria to the Westfield police station, where Detective Leonard Lugo told Maria not to tell anyone else about the letter. And apparently, the Westfield police had their suspicions right away about who might be responsible for the letter. On June 9th, Detective Lugo brought Michael Langford into the station for questioning. Now, spoiler alert, but I found Michael Langford's obituary because he has since passed away. And if you ask me, Michael Langford sounds like he was a pretty cool guy. In his photo, he kind of has the Stephen King glasses, so I might be a bit biased. But his obituary says that he was a voracious reader who would spend much of his time at the Westfield library, and that Halloween was his favorite day of the year. So naturally, I think I love him. And it doesn't surprise me that someone who's been described as offbeat was the first suspect that the cops could think of. I mean, they have no imagination, so they were like, weird letters must have been written by a weird guy. And I mean, absolutely no offense by calling Michael Langford weird. Coming from me, this is a compliment. Full respect for Michael Langford, full disrespect for the Westfield Police Department. Because it seems like the reasons why they suspected Michael Langford were: 1, he lived next door to the Broadduses at 661 Boulevard, where he'd lived since 1954 with his aging mother and several of his siblings. And 2, he was weird. Okay, cool. We got some real crack detectives on the case, let me tell you. So Detective Lugo harasses Michael Langford for a bit, but Michael Langford denies all knowledge of the letters, and he's eventually released by police. And he goes home to continue minding his own business, but unfortunately, it seems like Michael Langford would remain the police's main suspect for a long time, because 2 weeks after their first letter, the Broadduses received another correspondence from the Watcher in their mailbox. This time, the letter addressed to the Broadduses by name, though it was misspelled. It read,
Mr. and Mrs. Broaddus, welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy, and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have they found what is in the walls yet? In time, they will.
But this letter wasn't just addressed to the Broadduses by name. It also listed the names and nicknames of their 3 children, in birth order. The Watcher wrote,
I'm pleased to know your names now, and the names of the young blood you have brought to me.
The letter asked about one child in particular, who the letter writer had seen using an easel in an enclosed porch. Is she the artist in the family? The Watcher asked. The letter went on.
657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move in. It has been years and years since the young blood ruled the hallways of the house. Have you found all the secrets it holds yet? Will the young blood play in the basement? Or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It's far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Will they sleep in the attic? Or will you all sleep on the second floor? Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. It will help me to know who was in which bedroom. Then I can plan better. All of the windows and doors in 657 Boulevard allow me to watch you and track you as you move through the house. Who am I? I am the Watcher, and I have been in control of 657 Boulevard for the better part of 2 decades now. The Woods family turned it over to you. It was their time to move on, and kindly sold it when I asked them to. I pass by many times a day. 657 Boulevard is my job, my life, my obsession. And now you are too, Broaddus family. Welcome to the product of your greed. Greed is what brought the past 3 families to 657 Boulevard, and now it has brought you to me. Have a happy moving in day. You know, I will be watching.
I mean, I really gotta hand it to him. This shit is creepy. The part about the basement especially? I mean, if I read that shit, I don't know, maybe I'd be too terrified to ever go near the basement, but I'm just like absolutely titillated. I think my curiosity will get the better of me. This is why I would never survive in a horror movie. I'm too nosy. There's no way I wouldn't be going down into that basement and digging around immediately. Anyway, Derek and Maria were understandably freaked out, and they stopped taking their kids to the house. And because the police hadn't made any moves besides questioning the Langfords next door, the Broadduses hired a private investigator to stake out the house in hopes that the Watcher might be caught lurking around. They also hired Robert Lenehan, a former FBI agent, to conduct a threat assessment. Lenehan noticed several old-fashioned tics in the letters, that, in his opinion, pointed to an older writer. For example, the envelope was addressed to M.M. Broaddus, and the sentences all had double spaces between them. Lenihan also noted that the writing style itself suggested that the Watcher was a voracious reader and less macho. And then, on July 18th, the Broadduses found another letter from the Watcher in their mailbox.
Where have you gone to? 657 Boulevard is missing you. The house is crying from all the pain it is going through. You've changed it and made it so fancy. You are stealing its history. It cries for the past and what used to be in the time when I roamed its halls. The 1960s were a good time for 657 Boulevard, when I ran from room to room, imagining the life with the rich occupants there. The house was full of life and young blood. Then it got old, and so did my father. But he kept watching until the day he died. Now I watch and wait for the day when the young blood will be mine again. 657 Boulevard is turning on me. It's coming after me. I don't understand why. What spell did you cast on it? It used to be my friend. Now it is my enemy. I'm in charge of 657 Boulevard. It is not in charge of me. I will fend off its bad things and wait for it to become good again. It will not punish me. I will rise again. I will be patient and wait for this to pass, and for you to bring the young blood back to me. 657 Boulevard needs young blood. It needs you. Come back. Let the young blood play again like I once did. Let the young blood sleep on 657 Boulevard. Stop changing it and let it alone.
For the next 6 months, the house stood empty as the Broadduses refused to move in. Because of the contents of this letter, Lenihan, the former FBI agent who the Broadduses had hired, suggested looking into former housekeepers or their descendants. But the police's focus remained on the Langfords. So they asked the Broadduses to send a letter to the Langfords announcing their plans to tear down the house, hoping to bait a response from their main suspects, who included Michael Langford, his 90-year-old mother, or some of Michael's 60-year-old siblings who also lived in the house still, and had lived there since the 1950s. But this attempt to bait the Langfords didn't really work out. They didn't respond. So Detective Lugo brought Michael Langford in for a second interview, which also went nowhere. Eventually, the letters were tested for DNA, and it was found that the only DNA on the envelopes was from a woman. So the detectives did ask for DNA samples from the Langford women, but they didn't match the DNA on the envelope. Neither did Maria's. But apparently, the Broadduses also believed that the Langfords might be guilty, particularly because their home had a vantage point of the porch where the child had been painting with an easel, the one that was mentioned in the Watcher's letter. So they hired a lawyer and asked him to meet with the Langfords, who began to grow hostile towards the Broadduses and the Westfield police, claiming that they were harassing their family, which they were, because there were some other suspects that deserved consideration. First, you could take a look at the rest of the neighborhood. The private investigator hired by the Broadduses found 2 child sex offenders within a few blocks of 657 Boulevard. A contractor working at the house also noticed that a couple who lived behind 657 Boulevard kept a pair of lawn chairs suspiciously close to the Broadduses' property, and that he'd seen the couple sitting in these chairs facing the Broadduses' property as if watching from afar. And by the end of 2014, the investigation had stalled. In December, the Westfield police told the Broadduses that they had run out of options. So, in typical horror movie fashion, Derek showed the letters to his priest, who agreed to bless the house. And then the Broadduses put 67 Boulevard up for sale. They listed the house in February of 2015 for $1.5 million, allegedly to account for all of the renovations that had been done to the home. But as prospective buyers came to see the house, Derek and Maria shared with them the strange letters that they had received since purchasing the home. And since most people don't like to have fun, nobody seemed to want to move into the horror house with the shadowy secret cabal of stalkers. And the Broadduses were like, maybe it's the price. So in March, they dropped their asking price to $1.4 million. But they kept showing the letters to prospective buyers and warning them that the house came with a watcher who seemed very eager to fill the house's halls with young blood. And buyers continued to decline to make an offer on the house. So, after dropping the price one more time, exactly 1 year after purchasing the home at 67 Boulevard, Derek and Maria Broaddus filed a civil suit against John and Andrea Woods, the previous owners of the home. And the demands that they made in this civil suit were suspicious, to say the least. In their filing, they asked the Woodses to reimburse them the almost $1.4 million that they had paid for the house, along with hundreds of thousands of dollars in renovation expense reimbursements, attorney fees, and triple damages. Oh, and they also demanded to keep the deed to the house as well. After filing the suit, the Broaddus' attorney attempted to have the court records sealed, but it was too late. Reporters caught on, and the creepy details of the case blew up across blogs and newspapers and thrust the Broadduses and 657 Boulevard into the spotlight. According to the quotes collected by news reporters, some of the Broaddus' neighbors doubted whether there was any construction that happened at the home at all, stating that they never saw any construction vehicles or heard any noise, not even the supposed jackhammering that was listed as some of the necessary work that had been done in the basement. The suit was, of course, claiming that because the Woodses hadn't disclosed the receipt of that strange watcher letter before the sale of the house, they had deceived the Broadduses. And once the case went public, the Woodses filed their own countersuit against the Broadduses, claiming defamation and filing a counterclaim for damages. The Woodses' attorney claims that his clients were not legally required to disclose the letter before closing the sale of 657 Boulevard. Meanwhile, the Broadduses refused to speak to the media despite hundreds of requests. They lived for a time with Maria's parents and then with a friend somewhere on the Jersey Shore. But bad luck seemed to follow them wherever they went, as Maria's grandfather suffered a heart attack and the friend they were staying with had a grand mal seizure. And as the case became viral news, Westfield's mayor was quick to assure the townspeople that there was no threat to them from the watcher and that the police's investigation had been very thorough. This came as a surprise to many of the neighbors, who said that they were never spoken to by the police at all, with the exception of the Langfords, I guess, who were harassed non-stop. In fact, one neighbor even came forward and disclosed that they too had received a strange letter around the same time that the Broadduses had received their first letter in the mailbox. This letter was also signed by the watcher and was very similar in content to the ones that the Broadduses had received. But this neighbor said that because they had no young children and they had lived in the house for years, they just threw it away and thought nothing of it. Once again, I don't know if I'm jealous of these people or what. Like, would I enjoy being able to just not lose sleep over every single little non-existent threat in my life? Yes. But if I got this weird letter asking me about young blood and stuff hitting the walls, I think I'd want to check that out, you know what I mean? Anyway, the lawsuits between the Broadduses and the Woodses dragged on, and the Broadduses continued to take the house on and off the market. In May of 2016, they filed an application to tear down 657 Boulevard, hoping to sell the lot to a developer who could tear the house down and build 2 new homes in its place. But Westfield has some pretty strict zoning laws, and because the 2 lots would measure 67.4 and 67.6 feet wide, when the zoning laws dictate 70 feet per lot, the Broadduses had to apply for an exception from the Westfield Planning Board, which was ultimately denied. So in February of 2017, the Broadduses rented the house to a couple who had all grown children and a couple of big dogs, so they made it very clear they weren't scared of the watcher. But the rent that they charged the couple didn't even cover their monthly mortgage costs, so the house continued to hold the Broadduses financially hostage. And then, 20 days after the renters moved into 657 Boulevard, a 4th letter arrived. The letter was dated February 13th, the same day that the Broadduses had given a deposition in their lawsuit against the Woodses. It read,
"Violent winds and bitter cold, to the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife, Maria. You wonder who the watcher is? Turn around, you idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell anyone. Good move. I walked by the news trucks when they took over my neighborhood and mocked me. I watched you as you watched from the dark house in an attempt to find me, Telescopes and binoculars are wonderful inventions. 657 Boulevard survived your attempted assault and stood strong with its army of supporters barricading its gates. My soldiers of the Boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the Watcher. Revenge can come in many forms. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fire, maybe something as simple as a mild illness that never seems to go away but makes you feel sick day after day after day after day. Maybe the mysterious death of a pet. Loved ones suddenly die. Planes and cars and bicycles crash. Bones break. You are despised by the house. And the Watcher won.
The letter apparently also mentioned the renter somewhere, who agreed to stay only if the Broadduses installed cameras around the house. Eventually, a judge threw out the Broaddus' suit against the previous owners, and the family was left not just with the ball and chain of 67 Boulevard, but also with all the legal fees that were accrued over their attempts to sue the previous owners. And creepy stuff happening around here. And then, in December of 2017, several residents of Westfield received bizarre and threatening letters in their own mailbox. These letters had been hand-delivered, and strangely only seemed to appear in the mailboxes of the people who had been most vocal about criticizing the Broadduses around town. Later, Derek Broaddus would admit to writing these letters, posing as someone who signed off as friends of the Broadduses out of frustration for all of the criticism that his family had received from the town of Westfield. Like, it's not very cool for it to sound like there's something crawling across the ceiling right now while I'm recording this creepy video. Thanks. Can we cool it? While still in ownership of the home, the Broadduses received a substantial six-figure payment from Netflix for the right to dramatize their story. Meanwhile, the Westfield Police Department completely fell apart after it was discovered that several officers, including Detective Loogie himself, had been involved in a cover-up to protect the chief of police who had committed a hit-and-run in 2018. Lugo had falsified police reports to assist in this cover-up, and he was demoted from lieutenant to patrol sergeant while the Union County Prosecutor's Office took over the Watcher case. And then finally, Derek and Maria sold the house at 657 Boulevard for $959,000, which was a significant loss. Now, I've been going for a while, but before we end, let's talk suspects. This case is frustrating in the same way that the JonBenet Ramsey case is, okay? Because on one hand, it doesn't make sense that it was anyone outside of the family, and then on the other, it doesn't make sense that it was anyone in the family either. So here's what I think are the incriminating facts against the Broadduses. Now, everybody talks about how this house must have been outside of their budget, and their previous house was only $770,000, and this one's $1.4 million, and blah 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 blah. Whatever. Maybe they could afford it, maybe they couldn't. And it's just like fucking Westfield to gatekeep other people's richness levels. Like, I don't know their financial situation, but the fact that the house never went into foreclosure means that they were affording it somehow while also still not even living in it. So I don't know if I believe that it was a money issue. Instead, I want to talk about timing, because I think that that's where the most incriminating evidence lies. So the first letter, the one received by the Woodses, arrived at a very interesting time, because the Woodses were set to close the sale with the Broadduses, but hadn't yet closed. At this point, the Broadduses had probably put down a good faith down payment, but because the deal wasn't yet closed, it's the perfect moment to introduce a reason for the deal to fall apart. Now, the goal here could be two things. One, Derek realized that he couldn't afford the house but didn't want to disappoint Maria, so he wanted to give them another reason to have to back out of the sale, and what better reason than the safety of their children? Or two, the Broadduses want to introduce something that would give them leverage to negotiate for a lower price on the final sale. Because of the timing, the Woodses had probably already told other potential buyers that they had accepted another offer, and if the letter caused the Broadduses to back out of the sale, they'd have to go back to the sale phase, which real estate agents and sellers, want to avoid. So if the Woodses had received this letter and then disclosed it to the Broadduses, they might have been able to use it to negotiate for a lower price on the final sale. But obviously, if the Broadduses had sent the letter to the Woodses and either of these was their goal, it didn't work. So a couple days later, once the sale is final, they send a letter to themselves. Now the Woodses could potentially be held liable for not disclosing the danger of this stalker that came with the house, and that could give the Broadduses another reason to back out of the sale. But here's the thing. The Broadduses didn't immediately accuse the Woodses of deception for not disclosing the letter that they had received, nor did they demand to be let out of the sale. They only came for the Woodses a year after receiving the letters from the Watcher. And while I do find it suspicious that they demanded to retain the deed to the house in their suit against the Woodses, I have to say, the biggest wrench in the hoax theory is the fact that the Broadduses never moved into the house. Like, if they were the ones who were sending the letters, why wouldn't they move in? Like, why would they bounce from Maria's parents' house to their friend's house to even struggling to purchase another home if they were never actually in any danger? Just for appearances? I mean, by the time the story came out, their reputation was already completely dragged, so why not just move into the house? They were still paying for it, and also, why would they continue showing potential buyers the letters even though it was obviously scaring people off and causing them to have to continuously drop the price? And then I wonder, okay, like maybe it was one of the two of them, either Derek or Maria, and since the other partner didn't know, they had to keep up the act. But the lengths that they would have had to go to, I don't know, it just seems crazy that it wouldn't come out eventually. Plus, the letters that Derek actually did admit to writing just didn't have the same panache or flair for the dramatics that the original Watcher letters had. I also just don't really follow the motivation when it comes to the Broadduses being responsible. Like, if it was all a ploy to give them leverage over the house sale, it didn't work. If it was a hoax to give them a reason to back out of the sale, they never tried to get out of the sale. In fact, they didn't even blame the Woodses until a year later after getting the police involved. And sure, people have done more fucked up things. I mean, in my last Westfield video, I talked about John List, a man who murdered his entire family because he lost his job and couldn't afford his house anymore. But still, none of the motivations for the Broadduses to fake the letters really work out in the long run. And other people might say that they did it for the publicity or to sell the rights to their story like they did with Netflix, but they actually sued people for attempting to dramatize their story previously. And to be honest, the money that they got from Netflix probably didn't even help them recoup the money that they'd lost in legal fees and alleged renovations to the house. Now, I don't believe that Michael Langford had anything to do with the letters, and that family has been dragged enough, so we're not even going to talk about them as suspects. Let's just move right on. Some people have pointed out that the only person who benefited from this whole situation was the realtors, who stood to rake in more commissions the more times they sold the house. I guess that holds water, and I can't completely rule it out, but it seems like a huge gamble. I mean, like I said, people have done crazier shit, but I don't know. I don't know about that one. So let's turn to the unknown. Sure. It could be just about anyone. A neighbor, someone who decided to involve some random family in their twisted attempt at an ARG, someone with a twisted imagination and a desire to scare people. Can't relate to that. But let's get a little weirder, shall we? Now, I've found reports that the current owners of 657 Boulevard have called the police to the house a total of 58 times as of November 1st, 2022. Now, obviously, there are people coming by to look at the legendary Watcher house, especially since the Netflix show came out, and maybe the current owners feel uncomfortable enough with some of the visitors to call the police, but that's not the kind of reports that we're seeing here. The current owners first called police to 657 Boulevard a month after they purchased the home, on August 21st, 2019. Something had set off the alarm, but when the police arrived and searched the house, they found nothing amiss. Then, on October 16th, 2019, at 10:19 p.m., police were again called to 657 Boulevard after a tripped alarm indicated a possible break-in in the basement. But when they arrived, the responding officers found the basement secure, with no signs of forced entry. In May of 2020, the basement alarm brought police to 657 Boulevard again, and once more, they found it secure and were unable to locate the source of the triggered alarm. In December of 2021, the owners called 911 after a carbon monoxide alarm went off on the second floor, but police arrived and metered the entire home and were unable to locate any excess amounts of carbon monoxide. A month later, on January 27, 2022, another 911 call was placed from 657 Boulevard at 5 o'clock in the morning. The police report doesn't indicate what prompted the call, but it does state that EMS arrived on scene to assist. Most of the remaining calls are uneventful, and most happened in the past month since the show came out. But the frequent mentions of the basement alarm being triggered seem curious to me, because let's not forget what the Watcher said. And so, we've reached the point in the show where I draw the most outlandish conclusion, which is that not only is the Watcher not a hoax, it's not even a person. What if the Watcher was a supernatural being? What could be lurking within the walls of 657 Boulevard, mostly undetected, except for occasionally tripping an alarm? What might find a dark, dank basement a perfect lair to rest? What would be bound to a home and interested specifically in its preservation, sometimes even to the detriment of the family living there? And what might have a particular interest in the blood of young children? Yes, I'm talking about fairies, people. Now, don't come in here with your Tinkerbell fantasies, imagining some hot little half-dressed mini bitch with her sparkly wings. No, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about unfathomable elemental entities who want to eat your flesh and steal your babies, okay? Specifically, I want to talk about the entire class of fairies and entities known as house spirits. Now, there are a lot of legends of house spirits, especially in fairy-type folklore, like redcaps and kobolds and brownies. These beings inhabit a home, but usually stay out of sight of the human occupants. And as long as they are appeased with the proper offerings, they might help in maintaining the house or even do some household chores. But these beings are usually specifically tied to the house rather than the house's inhabitants. And if they feel that the homeowners are destroying their habitat, they could become deadly. And like the way that the house passed from owner to owner for the sum of only $1 in the house's early days kind of makes me wonder if there was some other kind of agreement going on. Like, what if Harry Lincoln Russell was in the business of developing a very particular kind of real estate? Beautiful manor homes that came equipped with a very special feature, a supernatural caretaker trapped within the walls, who would always make sure to maintain the integrity of the home. And as time moved on and superstitions began to die, this unnatural caretaker became a forgotten nuisance, haunting the foundation of 657 Boulevard, where he once was a welcome asset. Of particular interest to me is the Watcher's fixation on blood, particularly young blood. Some house spirits are believed to feed on small amounts of blood at night, like little vampire bats, and they particularly like the taste of children's blood. These entities are also known for being mischievous and playing pranks on the house's inhabitants. But if offended, they can become downright malevolent. Even helpful household spirits can turn into malevolent entities if mistreated, tormenting the families who live in the homes in which they reside. It's also part of house spirit lore that they can never be given a name, for when given a name, they can no longer be reasoned with or persuaded, and will become a force uncontrollable and destructive. And the Watcher certainly did become an uncontrollable and destructive force in the Broaddus' life, with the way that the story ruined their reputation and drove them out of Maria's childhood hometown. So, I mean, I'm just saying, think about it. Fairies!